A metaphor is a strange thing that can be used to illustrate a connection or likeness between seemingly unrelated things. It's fun to come up with our own, and it's oftentimes fascinating to discover them in media or art, where we can find a reflection of ourselves or our lives, and maybe understand ourselves better through that. In popular culture, this heavy use of metaphors is extremely prevalent in occult-related films or shows, and none is as pervasive as the use of vampires or werewolves. You know, a metaphor for sexuality, growing pains of becoming an adult, and sometimes even addiction. Looking at the most recent heavy hitters in pop culture, Twilight, The Vampire Diaries, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, it does become quite clear that the abundance of metaphors attached to each and every piece of lore in those shows, stories, muddies the waters quite a bit. And I don't mean that these metaphors need to have the same meaning universally. I am specifically talking about logical inconsistencies within one piece of media at a time that basically make it impossible to truly follow the metaphor thread all the way to the end. Since there are so many metaphors that are used in those shows and or movies, I'm going to narrow it down for this video. We're going to focus on the vampire or werewolf boyfriend trope and how its high metaphorization can potentially hurt young people filtering their lives through a supernatural lens. This isn't to say that bad relationships in real life happen because of these stories, like not at all, but it is important to examine this reflections of our expectations when it comes to relationships, because these shows are quite popular with teenagers in general. It is especially true for those people that consume media uncritically, but I think it's more common with younger people who have less of a tendency to overanalyze a show like this, since plotlines don't really require that much concentration, well, most of the time anyway. The trope is very simple. A human, or at least mostly human girl, falls for a vampire. Sometimes a werewolf, but most of the time the main character falls in love with a vampire. Their relationship is intense and does not compare to anything that doesn't have that signature doom gloom flavor that this one does. I mean, this is debatable, of course, but regardless, these supernatural relationships are oftentimes projected onto by the viewers and, through metaphor, made to work as a perfect representation of whatever unhealthy attachment they are trying to romanticize. Most of the time, what they're relating to here is the sexual metaphor.
Let me stretch.
Okay.
In all three examples I picked today, we have the same attitude towards sex throughout. It is intertwined with the very core of vampirism in the modern era, and even before then. It is oftentimes characterized as sinful, bad, an uncontrollable urge, a dangerous lust for blood, and especially that of a particular person. This approach is so common that we quite literally get a setup where the vamp boyfriend cannot control himself while drinking the blood of his girlfriend, and essentially somehow gets triggered, either sexually or in terms of bloodlust.
Her blood is clean, you're killing her.
In Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, a vampire Buffy falls in love with, has a soul which every other vampire in that world lacks. Not having a soul is treated similar to not having consciousness. This interpretation is not one-to-one. Unfortunately, writers of that show, they're not particularly consistent with what it means exactly. The same way none of the other media produced around this topic is, honestly. Like, I don't know what's up with that, but it is what it is. He has a soul because of a curse placed on him, and he loses his soul after Buffy and him sleep together for the first time. This was such an interesting plot point to see as someone who watched Buffy for the first time as an adult, who's got a degree in art, because it's curious how much of the classic metaphorization I'm just coming up with words here, but basically metaphor creating is going on here. It has been discussed at length that this particular plot point was created to explore the weird phenomenon of guys switching their behavior entirely, doing a full-on 180 after sleeping with someone. It has been confirmed by the creator of the show that it was the intention as well, so no one is like reading into it too much. Do you know what I mean? However, it is a perfect example for me to explain why I think that this type of metaphor is not really doing what writers think it's doing. Aside the obvious puritanical nonsense of punishing Buffy for having sex, there is a huge oversight when it comes to this faux parallels creatives draw between fiction and real life. Angel does switch up on Buffy, mirroring a lot of real experiences of people in real life, but his actions, they're devoid of gravity due to the occult nature of his behavior. Obviously, it's still not pleasant what he's doing. He is acting this way because his soul was literally ripped away from him, which puts us as the audience in a weird position. On one hand, the writers are pulling from real life to mirror it, to have something that resonates with us. On the other, they forget that when someone switches up on us like that in real life, they actually do it without the external control of their entire being. Angel is simultaneously an antagonist of the rest of that season and a victim. He does cruel, murderous things, but as we come to find out, he is basically two different people. In real life, if a guy acted like an ass, especially to this extent, God forbid, and then all of a sudden apologizes and keeps repeating that it wasn't him who did that, but his evil other self, not Kyle, but Kylus, we would not entertain that nonsense. At least most of us wouldn't. Of course, many people can say that this is just one example of this, and overall supernatural shows have great parallels to real life. And to some extent, it is partially true, but never fully true. Spike from the same show has the same issue of having to get a soul to actually be seen as a conscious being. Same goes to any vampire in the Vampire Diaries series as well. Damon had his humanity off. Stefan only killed him because he had his humanity switch off. They didn't mean it. It wasn't them. They would never do that if it wasn't for that pesky demon switch. This higher power is always deciding what happens to them. They never truly get reprimanded for what they do because they are oftentimes put in the position of a victim. And within that universe, it makes sense. But sometimes it's also a victim of their nature. And this is where we get into this weird territory where we have to acknowledge that when souls and switches aren't to blame for those characters' behaviors, it is blamed on the innate nature of the vampire or werewolf or whatever else, whatever other beast they may be. Somehow it's never enough to finally not see them as redeemable. And it is usually due to the fact that they are capable of human qualities and behaviors, unlike what we are told in terms of a lack of true empathy. And because their behaviors, they have to be human for anyone to ever want to watch that show, for anyone to have any feelings about them as characters and care. Also the fact that we in the real world know how horrible people can be, especially in zones and etc., that we do not actually see this behavior as solely dependent on a soul. Solely soul. Whatever. It is quite dangerous though that when souls and switches are out of the question, we are bombarded with the he is what he is sentiment that parallels that boys will be boys bullshit. Edward from Twilight, for example, does not have that issue of losing or gaining a soul or switching humanity on and off. Yet, he also gets that fateful scene of struggling not to drain your girlfriend dry of blood because, ooh, she's just too much of a personal brand of heroin for me. This scene still happens because his nature is already supposed to be enough of a deflector of critical thinking and questioning. It's just so convenient that all of these guys can still get love and support from people who they've wronged just because they're always at the mercy of something or someone else. Even though Angel waking up Angelus is an interesting plot point for the show and an interesting take on real situations, it is also a huge tool to excuse dangerous or offensive behaviors. Not to be all holier than thou here, but it's just not the same thing when the horrendous behavior is actually just a way of creating conflict that isn't grounded with the weight of that guy actually having to make a decision that he will be associated with. Another thing to consider here is, of course, age. Yeah, the romantic interests are always ridiculously old in the case of vampires anyway. But there's been a lot said about it, and I'm not particularly interested in specifically addressing how problematic that is. I'm sure you know that already. Like, I don't have to tell you that 240 is a bit too old to be dating a 16-year-old, right? Like, I don't have to be spending my time talking about this. I just want to talk about the fact that they are always a lot older. Always, and way too commonly over 100 years old. This is like a weird situation where it seems like they're trying to avoid comparisons with men that would be that age in real life. Like 117 or 104 is better than 42. 42 is easy to imagine as a living being of that exact age, you know. 117, 170 is just abstract enough that you can skip over that entirely. At least your mind is having a harder time imagining what that difference would actually be like mentally or otherwise. What are you doing? It's very easy to imagine what a 42-year-old man would be like in terms of maturity levels on average, but 117...
You got any of those little marshmallows?
It's just vague enough in our collective consciousness that it can benefit from it. I always wondered why they've never made a vampire love interest that's like 19 years old, dating a 17-year-old instead. Take Angel. Yeah, he killed many people. And then he got a soul and felt remorse. The years technically provide a more significant weight to his debauchery-ruled years and to the 100 years of remorse that he was moping through. But in a show where so much happens within 1 year, within one season, and characters become so complex as Buffy as quickly as she does due to her circumstances and just genuinely things that happened to her and her reactions to those things, I would argue that Angel could have achieved the same level of lore within 2 years of age difference with Buffy. Turned at 17, killed everyone in his way for a year, his family included, just like in the original, you know, and ensouled by 18, suffering in isolation for a year before coming to help Buffy. It would make a lot more sense why he's more tortured, why he is more of a gloomy person. It would also make more sense that he tried to help to atone for his sins immediately instead of it being 100 years of moping around, and then he sees a 15-year-old girl and he's like, I'm in love. Do you know what I mean? If all of these protagonists can gain that much background and lore within like what, a few books, episodes, films, then the romantic lead can believably have that too within that time frame. Like Angel could have been at a level of Buffy in season 3 in terms of lore. That's quite enough to be an interesting character with a dark past, but it's not so unreasonable in terms of how much we have to forego and how much we need to just kind of not notice about him as a being. Do you know what I mean? Yet they never want to give it to them. They never want to make them the character's actual age. And by character, I mean like the protagonist, obviously. Another thing that I found really fascinating about age in supernatural shows, movies, etc., is that the only few examples of younger love interests who were guys were werewolves. This is the case in Twilight, Teen Wolf, not for everyone because there's literally so many werewolves obviously, but like there's a couple of examples of that, the Vampire Diaries and Buffy as well. Of course, it is partially due to the lifespan of werewolves usually being the same as human or slightly higher, but in Twilight and Teen Wolf, the werewolf guys are not just as young as the protagonist, they are actually younger than her. It's also interesting that in many instances, these werewolves are with POC or mixed backgrounds. The vampires are always infantilized even at the age of 240. Yet werewolves are always made to be older or on the same level of responsibility as those a lot older guys. It's an interesting pattern, don't you think? Speaking of werewolves, they also have a disturbing underlying parallel to DV in like many of these stories. The most clear example of this is, of course, Twilight with Sam and Emily. He gets upset at something that she said and he loses control, turns into a wolf, and basically scars her for life. By the way, yes, I know that technically they're not werewolves. I get it. But it's just a technicality, like let's be for real. Werewolves are actually very strange in terms of being a subgenre of this supernatural boyfriend thing. They involve a lot of hierarchical bullshit between members of the pack. And it seems like, based on recent developments in cringe shows on short-lived apps, it is full of cringe to the very brim. I am personally interested in how these metaphors come to be and their use in modern media, especially since shows like Buffy had writers and creators directly state that a lot of supernatural situations or states are metaphors of real life challenges, events, or consequences. A story can be just a story without a subtext, I guess, to a certain extent. But I think that we should always look at metaphors that were written into the text and if they work. Because I'm genuinely not here to tell you that these stories are reasons as to why some people are in bad relationships or why they're in DV situations. I just think that if we're going to follow a metaphorical thread of vampirism or whatever else, honestly, it being akin to addiction or any other variable, we should see it stay consistent throughout that story. I do think that stories can suffer from rigid metaphors, but that is exactly why a whole ass person, a partner to the protagonist, no less, cannot be just a metaphor. They are supposed to be a character, not a concept. And this is exactly where this thread can get tangled and cause harm. It's not that the relationship is quote unquote bad, but it is the act of making it into a lesson condensed into a narrow metaphor that can cause a lot of confusion and a lot of projection from people in the audience, from, impressionable young people in general. I don't think that this is something that needs to be eradicated or something that needs to not happen in fiction. I just think that it's something that writers should think about more when it comes to literally making a whole ass person who's supposed to be the protagonist partner into a metaphor. This is the most clear in situations like Angel and Buffy, because Angel was literally written to be like kind of an obstacle to Buffy until they created more nuance when they moved Angel from one show into his own show and gave him more depth. But before, he was definitely just being used as like a hurdle for Buffy, which I don't think is realistic or useful to write characters that way in any capacity. Regardless of all of this, I just wanted to chat a little bit about this supernatural boyfriend trope and let me know what you think about it, because growing up watching these shows and whatever, I wouldn't say that I wasn't aware of the fact that they are vampires and that what they're doing is like not a good thing. For example, when they were snapping someone's neck or whatever the hell. But I do think that it does desensitize you a little bit to some really weird ass behavior from romantic partners, which isn't the cause. I actually think that it might be just a reflection of our culture as it already is. So I'm hoping to see more of a shift in that regard in the future, and I'm curious to see how it's going to morph with each year that our culture is going to be evolving as well. Check out my podcast. I am there every single week with Bisistent. Thank you to my patrons. See you soon.
Oh, I'll insult him if I want to.